Good day, everyone. I am Raymar Vigayo from 3AB Psych A. So I'll be reporting the Chapter 2, Topic 4, the Science of Psychological Measurement. So my report focus on the reliability estimate. So the topic outline of my report are first, test retest reliability estimate with its two subtopics, test retest method and test retest estimate. Second is psychologist's replicability crisis. The third, three major factors for the emergence of replicability crisis, such as lack of published replication attempts, editorial preference for positive over negative findings, and third, questionable research practices or the QRPs. Next, parallel forms or alternate forms reliability estimates. And lastly, the split half reliability estimates with it subtopic three steps to compute coefficient of split half reliability. The intended learning outcomes of my report are to explain the importance of reliability estimate, discuss the test retest reliability, distinguish parallel forms and as alternate forms reliability estimates, and obtain split half reliability estimates. So the test retest reliability estimate. One way of estimating the reliability of a measuring instrument is called test retest method. So the test retest method is by using the same instrument to measure the same thing at 2 points in time. And the result of such evaluation is an estimate of test retest reliability. So the test retest reliability is an estimate of reliability obtained by correlating pairs of scores from the same sample or from the same people and two different administrations of the same test. The test retest measures is appropriate when evaluating the reliability of a test that purports to measure something that is relatively stable over time, such as personality traits. If the characteristic being measured is assumed to fluctuate over time, then there would be a little sense in assessing the reliability of the test using the test retest method. For example, people may learn new things, forget some things, and acquire new skills. It is generally the case, although these are exemptions, that as the time interval between administrations of the same test increases, the correlation between the scores obtained on each testing decreases. The passage of time can be a source of error variance. The longer the time that passes, the greater the likelihood that the reliability coefficient will be lower. When the interval between testing is greater than 6 months, the estimate of test-retest reliability is often referred to as the coefficient of stability. An estimate of test-retest reliability may be most appropriate in gauging the reliability of the tests that employ outcome measures such as reaction time or perceptual judgment, including discriminations of brightness, loudness, or taste. However, even in measuring variables such as this, and even when the time period between the two administrations of the test is relatively small, various factors such as experience, practice, memory, fatigue, and motivation may intervene and confound the obtained measures of reliability. So the next is the psychologist's replicability crisis. In the mid-2000s, academic scientists became concerned that science was not being performed rigorously enough to prevent spurious results from reaching consensus within the science community. In other words, they worried that scientific findings, although peer-reviewed and published, were not replicable by independent parties. In 2015, a group of researchers called the Open Science Collaboration attempted to redo 100 psychology studies that had already been peer-reviewed and published in leading journals. It is according to Open Science Collaboration 2015. The results published in the journal Science indicated that depending on the criteria used, only 40 to 60% of replication found the same result as the original studies. This low replication rate helped confirm that science indeed had a problem with replicability, the seriousness of which is reflected in the term replicability crisis. So the three major factors or the three major causal factors for the emergence of replicability crisis. The first is a general lack of published replication attempts in the professional literature. Second, editorial preferences for positive over negative findings. And the third, questionable research practices on the part of authors of published studies. So first, let us discuss the lack of published replication attempts. Journals have long preferred to publish novel results instead of replications of previous works. In fact, a recent study found that only 1.7% of the published psychological scientific literature sought to directly replicate previous work, according to McKell et al. 2012. Academic scientists who depend on publication in order to progress in their careers respond to this bias by focusing their research on unexplored phenomena instead of replications. Replications by independent parties provides for confidence in a finding, reducing the likelihood of experimenter bias and statistical anomaly. Indeed, had scientists been as focused on replication as they were hunting down novel results, the field would likely not be in crisis now. The next is the editorial preference for positive over negative findings. Journals prefers positive over negative findings. Positive in this context does not refer to how upbeat, beneficial, or heartwarming the study is. Rather, positive refers to whether the study concluded that an experimental effect existed. The fact that journals are more amped to publish positive rather than negative studies has consequences in terms of the types of studies that even get submitted for publication. The net result is that scientists, policymakers, judges, and anyone else who has occasion to rely on published research may have a difficult time determining the actual strength of robustness of a reported findings. The next one is the questionable research practices or the QRPs. In this admittedly non-exhaustive review of factors contributing to the replicability crisis, the third factor is the QRPs. Included here are questionable scientific practices that do not rise to the level of fraud but still introduce error into the bodies of scientific evidence. For example, one variety of entails the researchers failing to report all the research undertaken in a research program, and then selectively only reporting the studies that confirm particular hypotheses. With only the published study in hand and without access to the researcher's record, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the research consumer to discern important milestones in the chronology of the research, such as what studies were conducted in what sequence and what measurements were taken. One proposed remedy for such QRPs is pre-registration. Pre-registration involves publicly committing to a set of procedures prior to carrying out a study. Using such procedure, there can be no doubt as to the number of observations planned and the number of measures anticipated. In fact, there are now several websites that allow researchers to pre-register their research plans. The next is The lessons learned from the replicability crisis. The replicability crisis represents an important learning opportunity for scientists and students. Prior to such replicability issues coming to light, it was typically assumed that science would simply self-correct over the long run. This means that at some point in time, the non-replicable study would be exposed as such, and the scientific record would somehow be strengthened out. Spurred by recognition of crisis of replicability, science is moving to right from both past and potential wrongs. As previously noted, there are no mechanisms in place for pre-registration of experimental designs and growing acceptance of the importance of doing so. Further, organizations that provide for open science, example essay and efficient pre-registration, are receiving millions of dollars in funding to provide support for researchers seeking to perform more rigorous research. Moreover, replication efforts beyond even that of the open science collaboration are becoming more common. When it comes to psychology's replicability crisis, there is good and bad news. The bad news is that it is real and that it has existed perhaps since scientific studies were first published. The good news is that the problem has finally been recognized and constructive steps are being taken to address it. So, the parallel forms and alternate forms reliability estimate. If you have ever taken a makeup exam in which the questions were not all the same as soon as the test initially given, you have had experience with different forms of a test. And if you have ever wondered whether the two forms of the test were really equivalent, you have wondered about the alternate forms or parallel forms reliability of the test. So let's discuss the parallel forms coefficient of reliability or coefficients of equivalence. So it is the degree of relationship between the various forms of a test can be evaluated by means of an alternate forms. So what is parallel forms? So for each form of the test, the means and the variance of observed test scores are equal. In theory, the means of score obtained on parallel forms correlate equally with the true score. More practically, scores obtained on parallel tests correlate equally with other measures. So next is the parallel forms of reliability. An estimate of the extent to which item sampling and other errors have affected test scores on versions of the same test when, for each form of the test, the means and variance of the observed test scores are equal. So that is the parallel forms reliability. So what is alternate forms? So alternate forms are simply different versions of a test that have constructed so as to be parallel. Although they do not meet the requirement for the legitimate designation, parallel alternate forms of the test are typically designed to be equivalent with respect to variable such as content and level of difficulty. The alternate forms of reliability refers to an estimate of the extent to which these different forms of the same test have been affected by item sampling error or other errors. So, let's discuss the alternate forms reliability and parallel forms reliability is similar in two ways to obtaining an estimate of test-retest reliability. So first, two test administrations of the same group are required, and test scores may be affected by factors such as motivation, fatigue, or intervening events such as practice, learning, therapy, although not as much as when the same test is administered twice. An additional source of error variance, item sampling, is inherent in the computation of an alternate or parallel form's reliability coefficient. Test takers may do better or worse on specific forms of the test, not as a function of their true ability but simply because of the particular items that were selected for inclusion in the test. Developing alternate forms of tests can be time consuming and expensive. Imagine what might be involved in trying to create sets of equivalent items and then getting the same people to sit for repeated administrations of an experimental test. On the other hand, once an alternative or parallel forms of a test has been developed, it is advantageous to the test user in several ways. So the internal consistency estimate of reliability or an estimate of inter-item consistency. Deriving this type of estimate entails an evaluation of the internal consistency of the test items. Through this, an estimate of the reliability of the test can be obtained without developing an alternate forms of test and without having to administer the test twice the same people. So lastly, the split half reliability estimates. So it is obtained by correlating two pairs of scores obtained from equivalent halves of single test administered once. It is useful measures for reliability when it is impractical or undesirable to assess reliability with two tests or to administer a test twice because of factors such as time or expense. So the three steps to compute coefficient of split half reliability. So the first step is divide the test into equivalent halves. Second step is calculate a person or between scores on the two halves of the test. And the third step is adjust the half test reliability using the Spearman-Brown formula. So it is discussed on, let's discuss it shortly. So the step 1, divide the test into equivalent halves. So to split a test is to randomly assign items to one or the other half of the test. So another acceptable way to split a test is to assign numbered items to one half of the test and even numbered items to the other half. This method yields an estimate of split half reliability is also referred to as odd-even reliability. Yet, another way to split a test is to divide the test by content so that each of half contains items equivalent with respect to content and difficulty. So the primary objective in splitting a test in half for the purpose of obtaining a split half reliability estimate is to create what might be called mini parallel forms, with each half equal to the other or as nearly equal to humanly possible in format, stylistic, statistical, and related aspects. So the second step is calculate a person or between scores on two halves of the test. So in this procedure entails the computation of person R, which requires little explanation on this point. However, the second step will be included on the third step that requires to use the Spearman-Brown formula. So the third step will be discussed by the next reporter, Riza Eileen Bulalo. So the summary of the report, my report are, so the test retest measures is appropriate when evaluating the reliability of a test that purports to measure something that is relatively stable over time, so such as the personality trait. Supported by recognition of the crisis of replicability, science is moving to right from both past and potential wrongs. So next is alternate or parallel form of a test. It is advantageous to the test users in several ways. And lastly, the split half reliability estimate is useful measures of reliability when it is impractical or undesirable to assess reliability with two tests or to administer a test twice. So that's my report, and thank you for listening.